Shit, fuck, shit, fuck. So, can you hear me now? Okay. So, I've heard people say it's more accurate to call ICE slave catchers as opposed to Gestapo. And as someone who's been obsessed with the Civil War since I was 8, all I can say is, yes! While the Gestapo is kind of the go-to example for a police state, they're not the best example, and we talked about why in another episode. Slave catchers, on the other hand, are very similar to what we are seeing now out of immigration and customs enforcement. The mission of slave catchers, like ICE, was to kidnap people with the endorsement of the federal government. The response to ICE's presence has been less than warm, let's say. But how did people react 170 years ago when a bunch of pathetic assholes came into their town and kidnapped their neighbors? Were they sweet and gentle to the kidnappers? Did they say, oh, well, of course you can steal people off the street. The law is the law, after all. No! Today, we're going to talk about one story in particular where people fought back. So, I read this book in college, and as you can tell by the book, that was a long time ago. It's called 1858 by Bruce Chadwick. And I remember there was a chapter in here on the Oberlin Rescuers, a group of abolitionists who successfully freed a man who had been kidnapped by slave catchers in the year 1858. But the story was way crazier than I remember. So, just some backstory. Enslaved people in the United States have been fleeing bondage since before it was the United States. By the 1700s, thousands of men, women, and children were escaping every year. In 1760 alone, 900 ads for runaways were printed in Southern newspapers. When the U.S. solidified its government in 1787, the founders included a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution, and it made clear that escape to a state that had outlawed slavery did not mean freedom. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was signed into law by President George Washington because he had a little fit after one of the humans he had enslaved fled to the North. The act granted rights to slave owners and their agents to search for runaways within the borders of free states. But this still didn't satisfy the plantation-owning elites. So, in 1850, they strengthened the law again, now compelling local authorities to help the hired kidnappers return people to slavery. This was the law in 1856, when John Price and 2 other enslaved people fled a plantation in Kentucky and made it to Oberlin, Ohio. Now, you may not know this, but Oberlin, Ohio was the most progressive and racially integrated town in the United States. Oberlin was a critical stop on the Underground Railroad. It was a safe harbor for runaways before they crossed into Canada. Oberlin College had been integrated by gender and race for decades by this point, and many of its faculty were active abolitionists and members of the Underground Railroad. That's right, Ohio. When Price arrived at this surprise oasis of equality, he was badly hurt and decided to stay rather than join his companions into Canada. He made a living working odd jobs around town. The citizens of Oberlin helped him when they could and had no concerns about breaking the Fugitive Slave Act. In fact, many free states, including Ohio, enacted their own personal liberty laws in defiance of the act. Most of the town's citizens openly despised slavery. But not everyone, even in a place like Oberlin, was on board. In September 1858, Lewis Boynton hired John Price to pick potatoes on his farm. On the morning of the 13th, Boynton's teenage son, Shakespeare, no, I'm not kidding, picked up Price in a buggy. As they were traveling, another buggy came up fast behind them. The pursuing carriage was carrying 2 slave catchers and the deputy marshal for Oberlin with papers to arrest Price and take him back to Kentucky. Shakespeare slowed down and pulled over because, as it turns out, the little shit was in on the whole fucking thing. So the 3 men grabbed Price, threw him in the buggy, and took off towards Wellington, a town about 8 miles south of Oberlin, where they planned to board a train for Columbus, and then, the next day, cross the Ohio River into Kentucky. But on the way, they passed 2 Oberlin students, Ansel Lyman and Seth Bartholomew. Price called out for help, but the 2 men acted like they didn't hear him. But they had heard him, and they immediately headed for Oberlin to find the leaders of the Anti-Slavery Society. When they made contact, the group reasoned correctly that the slave catchers were taking Price to Wellington Station. The men then fanned out across the town into stores and homes to rally as many people as they could. Before long, dozens of citizens had gathered in the town square, organizing transportation and gathering weapons. Soon, a caravan of determined abolitionists stormed out of Oberlin. Meanwhile, John Price and his kidnappers had just sat down for lunch at the Wadsworth Hotel, a 3-story building with a 2nd-story balcony and an attic room on the top floor. It was right down the street from the train station, and faced the large town square in Wellington. The kidnappers planned to wait at the hotel until the 5:13 train to Columbus. John was less than 24 hours away from being returned to slavery. As they passed homes along the way, the caravan of armed abolitionists grew. When they arrived in Wellington, they found a giant crowd of people had already formed in the town square. The crowd had been there since the morning, watching a fire that had consumed 2 buildings and was only now under control.
Because that's what they did back then. Fires were like Instagram.
So were hangings like Reddit?
Exactly. Oh my god, yes, exactly.
Like, oh, that person's a little weird. They spend too much time at the hanging.
True off my chest. I committed that murder. Church was like Facebook, it was full of like a bunch of people that you didn't want to actually see.
Ew.
The news of the rescue effort spread rapidly through the crowd, and hundreds more joined the group from Oberlin. The rescuers swelled to around 1,000 people. Many of them were not ardent abolitionists, but were infuriated by this invasion of slavery so far north.
One reason why was the year before, a lot of normies were shocked by the decision of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case.
In it, the court ruled that the government essentially had no power to ban slavery anywhere. Now, while most white people in the North were not immediate abolitionists, not even close really, they hated the idea of slavery being able to spread anywhere. This ruling was so unpopular, many Northerners became convinced that their government had been taken over by a slave conspiracy meant to protect the interests of the plantation class above all else. For many in Wellington, the presence of the slave catchers in their town confirmed their worst fears. As the crowd searched the buildings around the square, the intensity grew. When Price's location was finally discovered, the crowd gathered outside the Wadsworth. The kidnappers fled to the second floor, while the sympathetic hotel owner had his staff guard the entrance to the building. With nowhere to go, the kidnappers asked Price if he would tell the crowd he was willing to go back to Kentucky. Price, not wanting to be hurt, agreed. The slave catchers walked out onto the second-story balcony, with John trailing behind them, and were greeted with a chorus of boos. When the hostile crowd finally calmed down, the agents of slavery tried to explain how this was a federally endorsed kidnapping, and therefore totally legal.
This did not go over well.
Some people started to scale the facade of the hotel. The desperate men then turned to Price, who walked to the front of the balcony and began to address the crowd. He barely got a few words out when John Copeland, a 24-year-old black freedman from Oberlin, leaped onto the balcony. He pointed his pistol at one of the slave catchers and told Price to jump. The crowd began to shout, "Jump! Jump!" But another kidnapper grabbed Price by the arm and pointed his pistol at Copeland as they retreated to the third-floor attic. For the next few hours, town officials, lawyers, judges, and politicians came 2 at a time to negotiate with the slave catchers.
Some in the crowd went to procure a warrant for the kidnappers' arrest. Others went to get ladders.
As the 5:13 train drew nearer, a rumor spread that 1,000 federal troops would be on board. A rumor that the Oberlin deputy marshal helped spread. Though while he had telegraphed for help, he never actually heard a response.
When the train arrived with only civilians, the crowd was momentarily relieved. But then another rumor started that the 8 o'clock train would have 2,000 federal troops on it.
This was not such a far-fetched idea. A similar rescue effort in Boston for a man named Anthony Burns failed in 1854. The U.S. government then sent a detachment of Marines to transport him back to slavery.
As the sun began to set, the tension in the crowd at Wellington was building. Ansel Lyman, who was one of the first men to report Price's kidnapping, met with a fellow Oberlin student named William Lincoln.
They gathered a small group of men and stormed past the hotel staff at gunpoint. Then they marched up to the second story, but rather than attack the attic head-on, they occupied a guest room below it. They stacked furniture and straw from the mattress and prepared to burn the kidnappers out. At that same moment, John Scott, a 31-year-old freed black man, burst through the back door with another band of rescuers, mostly made up of black businessmen from Oberlin. Scott's men met with Lincoln's men on the second floor. When they learned that the attic door was only shut by a rope held by one of the slave catchers, a few of the men pulled it slightly open. William Lincoln then cracked one of the kidnappers in the head with the end of his gun. The man dropped the rope, and the rescuers came flooding through and began fighting with the slave catchers hand to hand. At the same time, people in the town square were climbing ladders and crashed through the attic window. The rest of the crowd outside rushed past the guards and up the stairs of the hotel. Richard Windsor, who had been in the attic meeting with the kidnappers when the attack began, grabbed Price and hurried him out of the room and down to the lobby, literally having to put him on people's shoulders and crowd surf him down the stairs. Cheers went up as Price emerged from the building. The men still fighting in the attic had no idea he was even gone. Windsor pushed Price into John Scott's buggy, and the driver took off towards Oberlin. When they arrived in Oberlin, he took Price to the home of Calvin Fairchild, a man who opposed slavery but was not as outwardly committed as some of his neighbors. The slave catchers never thought to look there, and after a few days, Price met up with John Copeland and members of the Underground Railroad and escaped into Canada.
The story of the rescuers captivated the nation. Abolitionists rejoiced at the victory, while pro-slavery assholes cried. And of course, even back then, there was a bunch of shitlibs who complained about the use of violence. As if slavery itself isn't horrifically violent, much less kidnapping someone and returning them to slavery.
Rescues of this nature had happened about once a year since the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850. But this would be the most widely covered event of its kind. Meanwhile, the federal government, led by the utterly incompetent James Buchanan, who Chadwick talks about in another chapter.
There's also a chapter where he talks about Jefferson Davis having herpes so bad he almost died. God, I love history. Anyway, the federal government wanted to make an example out of the rescuers. A pro-slavery judge appointed a pro-slavery grand jury that included the father of that little fucker Shakespeare from the beginning, and they charged 37 men with breaking the Fugitive Slave Act.
The charges were not actually about freeing John Price. It was a persecution of all abolitionist activism. The judge in the case actually said that the movement against slavery could be
characterized by bigotry and intolerance, as in they were being bigoted to the slave owners.
A disproportionate number of the accused were black, and 7 of the men who had been runaways themselves fled. Some of the men indicted had not even gone to Wellington, like Oberlin College professor, staunch abolitionist, and man who tragically lost his mustache in a duel, Henry Peck. William Lincoln was arrested in front of a small class he was teaching. He was held in handcuffs for an entire day until he could be arraigned in the federal court in Cleveland. The government wanted to prolong the agony of the rescuers, so the men were set to be tried one at a time. But when the defendants were asked if they wanted to post bail, they chose instead to stay locked up until all the trials could be done, despite the fact that this could take years. This action garnered a wave of support for the rescuers, and thanks to a sympathetic sheriff in charge of the prison, they received thousands of visitors, all while behind bars, including John Brown. Even though Brown was wanted for murder, he rode into Cleveland, watched some of the trial, held a rally, and sold some horses and mules he had stolen, and then snuck into the prison to visit the rescuers and recruit them for the raid on Harper's Ferry. And all he had to do to pull this off was stuff his big white beard into a shirt and wear a hat.
Imagine if, like, Luigi was still free and he would just pop in from time to time. That's how amazing this was. The trial turned when lawyers from the state of Ohio charged the slave catchers with kidnapping. The 2 men eventually refused to testify against the rescuers on behalf of the federal government.
The government slowly dropped all the charges against the remaining defendants. On July 6, 1859, the rescuers walked out of prison after 3 months. When they arrived in Oberlin, the entire town came to meet them and held a grand victory celebration.
They had won. They had freed John Price and returned home. They revitalized the anti-slavery movement that was reeling in the wake of the Dred Scott decision and made clear the public's resentment against slave power and its control over their government. It's obvious to say that we are fed a sanitized version of history, but that sanitization doesn't just apply to the people on the wrong side of history. There's a tendency to paint the people on the right side of history as placid, as always doing things the right way, and earnestly trusting in the system. But that is bullshit. An institution like slavery that imprisoned millions of people and generated billions of dollars of wealth wasn't going to go away just by saying please. An organization like ICE, with a mandate to enforce white nationalism by any means, cannot be reformed. People know abolitionists were on the right side of history now, but it wasn't as clear at the time. Abolitionists broke the law. They protested. They went to prison. They destroyed property. They trespassed. They got a little violent from time to time. And when they saw something that they knew was wrong, they acted. And so should we. Inaction may seem like the safest thing in the present, but it is the most dangerous thing for the future. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and follow us on all the socials.
I think you can see a direct connection between where the citizens were then and where our community is today in regard to issues like the sanctuary movement. So in the Oberlin and Wellington rescue, they were in essence providing sanctuary. They were going out and rescuing somebody, bringing them into sanctuary, and getting them to a safe place where they could live out their life.
Got this. Dred Scott this. I literally can't say it.
Dred Scott decision.
Dred Scott this. Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott decision. I literally can't say it. Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott this. Dred Scott decision.
There you go. Now you
Okay.
have a good